Hi, welcome. Welcome to Brown Bag Lit. We're really happy to have you here. My name is Chloe Yelena Miller, and I'm one of the co-founders. Shasta Grant, who is here, she and I started Brown Bag Lit just this January, and today we're happy to welcome you to Self-History as Community History with Gayle Brandeis and Leta McCollough Seletzky. We hope you'll join us for some future classes or readings. Throughout May, we're offering poetry classes on Tuesdays and prose classes on Thursdays, both at noon Eastern Standard Time. You can find all of our upcoming classes on our website, brownbaglit.com. Our next and last event of the spring season is on Wednesday, May 17th from 12 to 1 p.m. with Jolene McCullough. And it's a reading and conversation about her new book of short stories, Sidle Creek, which is wonderful. And I think she might be here. If she is, I hope she gives a wave. We also have a brand new offering, which is the summer residency. It's an asynchronous class that will last for 3 months. You'll receive weekly prompts, one-on-one meetings, either with myself for poetry or Shasta Grant for prose. You'll get some personalized feedback in response to some of your submissions. We'd love to have you join us. You can find all of our details on our website, brownbaglit.com. And if you register by Friday, for those of you who are here today and you use the code HISTORY, you're welcome to use the early bird price, which is expired, but you lucky participants are welcome to that discount if you like. So please make sure that you stay muted during our reading today. I recommend you put the screen on speaker view during the talk and then maybe gallery view for the Q&A. Do keep the chat open. You can share thoughts and responses to the authors as they're speaking, and any questions that you might have will be saving throughout so that we can use them during the Q&A. Please note that while our readings and craft talks are free, we hope that you support the authors by purchasing their books. I'll be putting all of the links into the chat. And now, as we get started, I'd like to introduce co-founder Shasta Grant, who will introduce our authors. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to have Gayle and Leta here. I am going to introduce both, and then we will turn it over to the two of them to chat. Gayle Brandeis is the author, most recently of Drawing Breath, Essays on Writing, the Body, and Loss. Earlier books include the memoir, The Art of Misdiagnosis, the novel and poems, Many Restless Concerns, shortlisted for the Shirley Jackson Award, the poetry collection, The Selfless Bliss of the Body, the craft book, Fruitflesh, Seeds of Inspiration for Women Who Write, and the novels, The Book of Dead Birds, which won the Penn Bellwether Prize, Self-Storage, Delta Girls, and My Life with the Lincolns, chosen as a statewide read in Wisconsin. Gayle's essays, poetry, and short fiction have been widely published in places such as The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, the Oprah Magazine, The Rumpus, Salon, and more, and have received numerous honors, including the Columbia Journal Nonfiction Award, a Barbara Mandigo Kelly Peace Poetry Prize, notable essays in Best American Essays 2016, 2019, and 2020, the QPB Story Magazine Short Story Award, and the 2018 Multi-Genre Maverick Writer Award. She was named a Writer Who Makes a Difference by the Writer magazine and served as Inlandia Literary Laureate from 2012 to 2014, focused on bringing writing workshops to underserved communities. Gayle teaches in the low residency MFA program at Antioch University and University of Nevada, Reno at Lake Tahoe. She currently lives in Highland Park, Illinois, with her husband and youngest child. Leta McCollough Seletzky is a National Endowment for the Arts 2022 Creative Writing Fellow, whose work has been featured in The Atlantic, The New York Times, the Oprah Magazine, The Washington Post, and elsewhere. Her essay, The Man in the Picture, published in the Oprah Magazine, was selected as a notable essay in Best American Essays 2019. An alumna of Northwest University and the George Washington University Law School, she is the author of the father-daughter memoir, The Kneeling Man. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having us, Chloe and Shasta, and thank you everyone for being here. I am so delighted to be doing this event with Leta today. And just wanted to share with all of you that I first met Leta when she audited a creative nonfiction class I was teaching at what was then, I forget if it was Sierra Nevada College or Sierra Nevada University. We've switched names a few times.
I think it was college.
It was still college. It was the OG name. Yeah, and so that's how I first met Leta, and she started writing what became this amazing book when we were together in that class. And I thought we could start, Leta, by talking about the evolution of our books. And if you would like to share your journey with this book, that would be amazing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gayle. Thank you to Brown Bag Lit and everyone for being here. This is just really, really meaningful to gather with you and talk about writing and these books. So the evolution of this book and the journey of it, what a long and winding road, which I suspect is the case for many books in their own unique way. In the case of The Kneeling Man, yes, as Gayle mentioned, I started writing this book as someone who was auditing a creative nonfiction writing class at what was then Sierra Nevada College in Incline Village, Nevada, in the Tahoe area. For those who aren't familiar, this is in the High Sierra. Essentially, it's like a ski village. And through a set of uncanny and rather, I guess, difficult circumstances in many ways, I found myself there living in Incline Village in a house that I had bought as a vacation home originally, but ended up moving into with my two kids while my husband was working overseas in Nigeria. And this is during the Ebola virus epidemic back in 2014 in West Africa. Anyway, so I'm up there in the mountains where I had never planned to live. I was, completely bewildered by everything, not only just, culture shock and then having to learn to live, with the bears and the other wildlife and taking care of this old house, with these kids and, just meeting people, I was lonely and I was having to sit with a lot of things that I've been running from for a long time, many of which are now in this book. So anyway, I decided that I needed to stop running from these issues that I'd spent my life avoiding. And I knew that I needed to write about them, but I didn't know really where to start. And so I was really delighted when I learned that not only was there a great little college down the road from my house, but they had an excellent English department, and there was a fabulous writer who was teaching a creative nonfiction writing class. So I just thought, wow, okay, well, I'm not going to take this class for credit because, I've already been through school and everything. I just want the knowledge. I'll just audit the class and pay the, little money, however much it costs. And so that's what I did. And I believe it was in January or so of 2015 that this class began, and it ran through May, as I recall. And so twice a week, I'd go there, I'd take my kids to school, in the morning and, do my thing, household stuff. And then I'd go to this class and I would just sit there and, do the writing exercises and the very, the excellent prompts that Gayle gave us. And out of that class and those prompts, I got a number of pieces that I wound up editing and polishing and getting published. But then, the main one is this essay, The Man in the Picture, which began from one of Gayle's assignments, took it, got it published in Oh, the Oprah magazine, and then that became the seed of this book. So that's the journey in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Leta. And for those who don't know, it's the picture she's talking about is the famous picture taken right after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and her father is the man kneeling behind Dr. King. And Leta, just from the time you were in my class, I knew that you had such important things to say, that your voice rang so clear and true on the page. And we became friends very quickly, just because both of us had kids around the same age. And I'm just so grateful that you chose to join the class and that it ended up becoming this amazing book. And would you like to read from it a little bit? And then I can talk a bit about my book.
Sure, absolutely. So I will read a selection, and this is from a chapter called Work of a Nation, chapter 22 of the book. And so, I mean, this is really this is the end of the book, but it's sort of summing up the narrative, which is a braided narrative of my father's story as a Black man who, was born in Jim Crow, Mississippi, who went on to become an undercover Memphis police officer in the late 1960s and infiltrating a Black militant group in Memphis. And through that work, wound up in this photograph, having witnessed the assassination of Dr. King, and then went on from there to a career as a CIA officer for decades. And so this, and then intertwined with that narrative is my story and how all of those events affected my life and our relationship, and kind of essentially, the fallout from that and the healing from that. So anyway, I'm going to read this short selection. All right. Looking back over the life he'd led and the one he was set to lead, he was satisfied. He'd had a varied career, working in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. He'd witnessed acute inflection points in the history of national intelligence, a hostage rescue that garnered the world's rapt attention, and the ensnaring of traitor Aldrich Ames. Of the agency's 4 main divisions, the Directorates of Intelligence, Operations, Administration, and Science and Technology, he'd worked in 2, Operations and Administration, plus the Inspector General's office. His path hadn't been a straight line, but meandering and circular, in the way that a trail up a steep hill encircles as it advances. That his labors took him from the Army to menial odd jobs, to the Memphis Police Department, to the CIA may seem improbable, so much so that it's almost understandable to resort to labyrinthine conspiracy theories to try to make sense of what happened. The truth is far simpler, if more unfathomable. It was his life's circumstances that laid his path, based on his choices at each step. What or who spun that web of circumstances with all its synchronicities, horrors, and triumphs? It's a question with answers as numerous as a gemstone's scintillating facets, collecting light to reveal depth and fire. Could these answers even be written in the stars? After all, the figure of a kneeling man illuminates the night sky as the constellation Hercules, the complicated ancient protagonist of many journeys and labors. I'd returned to this question countless times over the years as I considered the events that shaped my own life in ways reminiscent of his, due to either similarities or sharp differences. Economic circumstances hadn't compelled me to enlist in the Army, thanks in part to my father's financial support and the employment opportunities his CIA career provided for me. In fact, I turned down the opportunity to apply for an agency-sponsored program that would have paid for my college education in exchange for a commitment to work there when I graduated. I just didn't think it was for me. Looking back, the choice reflects breathtaking privilege. Not that I was anything close to wealthy. I just had enough economic and social resources at my disposal to have choices. Still, when I arrived at my chosen university to pursue my chosen studies, I was broke. So broke that I fell into the trap that ensnares many a naive and financially illiterate freshman as they walk down their campus's main drag. Seductive credit card companies with their slick sales pitches, easy applications, and cheap promotional loot. Okay, I'm gonna skip down a little bit. There were other points at which my life echoed Dad's in eerie ways, such as my becoming, briefly, an assistant federal public defender, the opposite side of the courtroom from the police. or the short time I lived in Africa, though under corporate rather than governmental auspices. If his path had been improbable, mine had followed a similar, if less momentous, course. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Leta. So wonderful. And oh my goodness, there's so much for us to talk about. I'll share a little bit from my book, Drawing Breath, which had its own long and curvy journey, since this is a collection of essays that was written over the course of 20 plus years. The title essay, Drawing Breath, was actually, I wrote it as part of my MFA requirements, and I graduated in 2001. So it's been a while. And so this book, it wasn't the deep dive that Leta's is with my memoir. I was able to do a deep dive. These were short deep dives into a variety of topics that I was curious about, that I was haunted by, that I just needed to explore. And as I wrote each one, I wasn't imagining they would become a book. They were just written because I was burning to write each one. And put together, they become a bit of a map of my life and my writing life. And I'm going to read a short essay, a more recent one from the beginning, that explores my whiteness a little bit, which I've just really started to do in the last few years, is explore my whiteness and my privilege on the page. And it's because of my privilege and whiteness that I haven't felt the need to address those things in the past. I wish I had. I'm grateful for all the voices out there that have encouraged me to take a more critical look at my own presence in the world racially. And yeah, so I will read this essay called White Footprints. I am learning the names of my childhood world. I learned the weed I loved, the one with smooth green leaves circled around a tall spike, a spike I used to love to run my fingers down, strip it of its little green buds, is called plantain. Like the fruit, but not like the fruit. I learned plantain is a healing plant. If you chew or crush it and press it to your skin, it can stop bleeding, neutralize bug bites, bring splinters to the surface. I had thought it was a Midwestern plant. When I saw it for the first time in California years after I left Illinois, I fell to my knees, fell back into my child body. I learned it's also called white man's footprint. Learn it was brought to America by colonizers. Learn my journey west mimicked its own. So many white footprints. I learned the boulders that line the shore of Lake Michigan, boulders I spent hours scrambling over, smelling their cool mineral breath, their texture embedding itself into my palms and knees, are called riprap, are there to slow erosion. Riprap feels like too silly a name, too close to riffraff, to the trip trap of goats on an ogre's bridge. These stones are majestic, the vertebrae of a giant serpent hugging the edge of the lake, the backbone of my life. I knew the name Potawatomi. Now I learn Odawa. Now I learn Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox. Now I learn the names of peoples ripped from the land so I could one day call it home. I learned the name Chicago comes from the Algonquin, Chicaquah, meaning striped skunk, and onion, meaning pungence. I learned the shores of Chicago once reeked with wild onions and leeks and ramps. I never found members of the allium family as a child, but can picture myself pulling them from the sand, can picture myself biting into the sulfurous bulbs. There's so much beneath the surface, so much that burns in the throat. That's that essay. And it's interesting, I hadn't realized, oh, thank you, Chloe, how much I was longing to return to this place of my childhood until I put this book together. And Lake Michigan is all over the place in this book. I grew up right across the street from the lake in Evanston, Illinois. I know, Debbie, you're there now. And the lake really helped form me. It helped give me this sense of possibility because I looked out at the lake and it just felt limitless, and it helped me feel limitless inside. And it became just, when I think of home, I thought of the lake. And that just kept showing up in my essays as I put this book together in the early days of the pandemic. I got sick really early on and had a lot of brain fog and wasn't able to do a lot of writing, but I realized I have this great backlog of essays. Maybe I can see if they would make a collection together. And so I started pulling them together, seeing what would speak with one another. Yes, Amanda, yeah, we should talk. And so that was easier to do than write. And I realized that I have all these various preoccupations and obsessions that have been with me throughout much of my life, and that these essays really did speak to one another. So they told, this story of me as I stitched them together, but they also told this story of place, and of the place that I considered home. And I realized, wow, I really think I want to go back to Chicago. And then just coincidentally, the company my husband works for decided to open a Chicago office. And my husband turned to me and said, "Do you want to move to Chicago?" And it was like, of course. Once he said that, I couldn't think of anything else and couldn't consider doing anything else. And it was putting this book together that helped me realize how much I was longing to return. A friend of mine said, "You wrote yourself home." And I think that's so true. And Leta, in your book, I copied down some quotes where, even though you haven't moved back to Memphis, Memphis becomes so important in your book. And if you're okay with it, I'm going to read a couple of passages where you speak about Memphis. So you write, and as we're talking about self-history as communal history, I think place is so much a part of that. And so you write, like people, cities have personalities, they have souls. And you write, as much as I complained about Memphis, put it down, even fled from it, I missed it as if it were a person. If I couldn't love Memphis, then I couldn't love myself. And you later talk about your dad returning to the South and how you couldn't understand why he would choose to move back South after experiencing so much racism there. And you write, I realized that though I thought I was running from the place, I'd wound up doing something similar. And you talk later about how your gardening connects you to your grandparents, connects you to their gardening, their cultivation of the land. And you write, perhaps it's something most of us do on some level, try to recreate a place where we spent our formative years. And I love that that was in there, and how in my book too, it's like returning to the place of my formative years. And then I did end up returning here to live. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about how you wrote yourself home in a different way through this book.
I love that phrase, writing yourself home, because I think that is so apt. And I think definitely that was part of what was happening in The Kneeling Man. And it's, Memphis, it's in some ways a character in the book, it's Memphis is home, but Memphis in a sense was never really home. It's one of these situations where home is not completely home, because you don't, or I didn't feel completely at home. I didn't feel like I belonged because of, it wasn't just sort of this internal stuff that was going on with my dad and, the just kind of running from that story, but the racism, the legacy of Jim Crow. And in a sense, I tell people, even though I grew up there in like the 80s and 90s, early 90s, it really was still segregated, and you couldn't go anywhere without getting that feeling, like that shadow. And so I resented it. I remember from an early age, like, age 5, the age of my soon to be kindergartner, thinking that I'm going to leave this city as soon as I have the ability to do so. I watched a lot of television. And so I had a sense of, other places. And I just thought, like, it doesn't have to be like it is here. I recognized very early that things were not right and that I wasn't ever going to be able to I was never going to fully belong, and I wasn't going to be able to become who I was supposed to become. And so yes, Memphis was home, but it wasn't home. It felt in some ways like a toxic relative that I had to live with for a time. And I had to work through that in this book to, because I still love the place, and, having to unpack that and recognize that, the answer is not to uproot myself, because that's what I was doing, by sort of trying to distance myself from this place. I was becoming a rootless person. And that was reflected in sort of the semi-nomadic lifestyle that I ended up taking on with my family, moving around from place to place and really embracing that. And so the book just helped me to come to terms with, I guess, the pain and grief that I had about this place, but also the fact that I really was rooted there, and I shouldn't tear up those roots, but instead I needed to find a place of peace and a way forward, with this place where I came from and where my family still is. And there's so much to love about Memphis, by the way. I don't want to get overly negative, but there's a lot of pain there, and I can't just, glide over that either. I love the place. I think there's so much about Memphis that's beautiful and unique. There's so many creatives that come out of Memphis. I think it's a rich place, a rich soil. I love that city. But that city hasn't always loved me and people like me. So that's kind of what I've been wrestling with.
Thank you so much for that, Leta. And I'd love to talk a little bit about, since we're talking about self-history as communal history, you did such a beautiful job of balancing your story and your dad's story and weaving them together. And I think about the title essay in Drawing Breath. It's about the connection between breath and writing, and I divide it into inhales and exhales, where the inhales look inward toward my own experience with breath and writing, and then the exhales are looking outward and researching things, smart folks have said about breath and writing. So bringing together my experience with the larger picture, which is something I try to do in many of these essays, where I look beyond my own experience through research, through sharing other voices, things like that. So it becomes a conversation with the world and not just looking inward, although, of course, looking inward is important too. And I'd love to hear about your experience choosing the balance between your story and your dad's story and the larger American story, and how you came to that beautiful braid.
Thank you. Yes. And first of all, I just want to say that title, Drawing Breath, and then this pattern of inhale and exhale, I think is so gorgeous and so fundamental, because breath is life. That is the rhythm of life, is inhale and exhale. And we can even see that, in nature, with the rhythms of the planet and of the cosmos, really. And so, yes, breath is life. And it is a rhythm that has its balance. And I think trying to balance these stories and sort of the inward and the outward, and, in the case of The Kneeling Man, braiding together, my own inner memoir type story and then my father's story. It was tricky. And that was one of the things that scared me the most about writing the book, because my dad's story is one that's not only intensely personal, but it's also very much a story that is of historical import, I think, with his presence in that photo and so much that has been unknown about, why he was there at the Lorraine, and why then did he go on to become a CIA officer and so forth. And so, like, my little story just felt kind of puny in comparison to that, which I think I kind of alluded to in the reading I did earlier. So it's sort of like, I see that, looking back, he and I did follow certain tracks, in terms of I guess the criminal justice system, where I was a public defender, he was a cop. So we were kind of on opposite sides of the courtroom, but doing that, the international life. And so I could see a way, to marry these, or not really marry the stories, but kind of weave them together. But I was really concerned that, I wasn't sure how much of myself to put in this book that had so much really gripping and weighty material from his life. And so I spent a lot of time early on just trying to map it out, just trying to figure out a structure, like a skeleton for the book. Like, how was I going to do this? Like, was I going to have 10 chapters about my dad and then one about me, and then 10 more. And so I thought, well, that doesn't really make sense. And so what I did was I ended up just kind of putting those maps to the side and putting aside those outlines. And I said, okay, let me just tell the story the way that I want to. Like, if I were just telling somebody this story, tell me about the kneeling man. So I just wrote that out. And then naturally there came certain points that reminded me or evoked something in my life. And so that was a natural break. That was a natural place to inhale. And then kind of tell my, tell my story in a way that kind of linked with an element of his. And then, that ended up becoming a natural pattern in the rhythm of the stories themselves. And so that's how I ended up tackling that.
Beautiful. I think both of our work has been centered around the breaking of silence a lot. For me, writing these essays over the years and writing my memoir as well involved a lot of breaking of personal and familial silences, which is so hard to do. And I often drew upon Audre Lorde saying, "Your silence will not protect you." That guided me a lot as I wrote both some of these essays and my memoir. And you write about silence too. Like at the beginning of the book, you write, "Dad and I had been maneuvering around a gulf of silence for as long as I can remember." And later you talk about how scary it is to dive into this story. You write, "I jumped into Dad's story, not knowing what I'd find and afraid of what I might uncover. I was afraid of what I'd have to feel. If I had anything you could call an angle, it was to examine that, push through it, and come out the other side trembling, story in hand," which I thought was such a beautiful passage. And then later toward the end, you write, "I sometimes wonder what my life would look like if I hadn't asked Dad about his story, or if I hadn't pushed through my tears to read past the third page of his notes," which he had written a while back. It scares me to think about that. And I wonder if you could talk about pushing through fear. And I'm sure there are writers out here with us who might have their own gulfs of silence in their life as they want to tell this larger story about family or community or both. And what were you able to do to help yourself push through those fears and be able to finally tell this story that was burning inside you?
Yeah, the fear was so big. It had been growing, my whole life. And, the issue of silence is one, so many people are carrying, these silences. It's a very common thing. And I heard a writer say yesterday that, well, actually, let me back up. So silence is something that often exists around secrets. I mean, silence and secrecy go hand in hand, right? And so I heard a writer yesterday say that the secret is a cousin of the lie, that lies and secrets, they're kind of, they're part of the same kind of circle of things that can loom over us, that can, I guess in many ways kind of push us down, can kind of keep us from really exploring things that we need to explore, even though they're so scary. It's and the other thing is that there's no comfortable way to do this. And it's sort of like breaking a silence is not an easy thing. And I searched so long for a comfortable way to do it or an easier way to do it. And there really was no easy way. It was like breaking a glass. Like, how are you going to elegantly break a wine bottle? I mean, that's really what it was, like a magnum size of, a bottle of champagne or something. So at a certain point, I just had to make peace with that and just do it. And what helped me to do that? I think that the prospect of maintaining the silence had to become scarier than what might be on the other side of that silence. That's really what it was. I mean, that's what it boiled down to, that the risk of not telling the story began to seem greater than the risk of exploring the story. In addition to that, I had to be gentle with myself. I mean, that's where self-care comes into play, I definitely had those writing days where it's like blood on the page, crying jags, spiraling. But I can't do that every day. I don't think anyone should do that every day. One must take care of oneself. And so I definitely had to take breaks and just listen to myself when it was too much, and have other outlets, other creative outlets, and just being out in nature, physical activity, a spiritual practice, taking care of what I was taking into my body, not only nutritionally, but just mentally. And so those are some of the things that helped me to get past that and really to dive into this, what felt like a black hole of, I don't know what I'm about to find out. I do know that whatever I do find out, I won't be able to unknow it. But that's the chance I'm going to have to take.
Beautiful. Thank you, Leta. Yeah, I've found that in writing some of the hardest scenes that I would often just have to lie down on the floor afterwards. And it was like to literally ground myself and just feel the ground beneath me and get my, calm down my nervous system and just take some deep breaths and ground myself back in my body and remind myself I'm right here, I'm safe. I'm not in that scary moment anymore. And I think it's so important to talk about that because it can be so hard to write about these painful things. And both of us in our work explore epigenetic trauma a little bit. I have an essay that explores my great-grandmother and her experience with tuberculosis and how perhaps, some of that is still living in my body. I had a TB test done and it was read as inconclusive. And I thought, is that, my great-grandmother's tuberculosis still living inside me and all the trauma around that, where she was separated from her children and put in a sanitarium and never saw her children again. They never saw her again. And, we carry our ancestors in our bodies and their traumas. And you write, you said, for my family, the assassination was a lifelong wound, something we didn't touch for fear of aggravating it. I imagine the same was true for many. Somehow it managed to become part of my lived experience, though I hadn't even been born when it happened. It had always been there, like the background of a bas relief, maybe even encoded in my DNA alongside other trauma from generations past. It hurt. And I wonder, just, when we're speaking of kind of writing beyond the self, writing about community, we do carry, a community inside our bodies as we carry with our ancestors. All of that ancestral stuff is under our skin. And I'm curious to know, just how much that came into play, the epigenetic stuff as you wrote this. Were you thinking about your ancestors a lot in your writing? I feel like that's something that's been a more recent exploration for me in the last few years. I've been on this obsessive genealogical quest and trying to connect with my ancestors through my body, through my writing. And in doing so, hopefully maybe heal some of that generational trauma. And I would love to hear your thoughts about that and how you carry your ancestors forward in your work.
Yeah, I mean, my ancestors were always there from the beginning. I mean, that is actually, there's this part of the book where I talk about how, and you alluded to this, how my dad had given me these notes about his life. When I initially asked him to tell me his story in this very inelegant way, I was like, so, hey, Dad, how you doing? Yeah, we never talked about the King assassination. I need to know, tell me about that. And also your entire childhood, which I don't know about. And so he's like, okay, so I will send you some notes. I'll put together something. Then you read those and we'll just start there and we'll talk about it. So then he sends me this 17-page document, in Word format. It's like, I believe it was Courier font, so I get this and I'm like, okay, now we can rock and roll. And so I start reading this thing thinking, okay, now, the silence has been broken and we're going to go forward. And so I start reading this thing and it starts off, 1944, Tibbs, Mississippi, which is in Tunica County, Mississippi, one of the poorest counties in one of the poorest states during like the height of Jim Crow. And so I'm like, okay, bracing myself. I could just, I feel myself getting emotional. And then he starts to describe how, his mother and father, Walter and Lucille, had 12 children, and he starts naming them, the names. And it's just getting even, my emotions are just continuing to just well up in my chest, and these little thumbnail sketches of them. And so these are ancestors, and Walter and Lucille, the parents. And for this reason, like, I don't make it past page 3 and before I break down, and I'm just like, I'm not ready to do this right now. And I'm just going to step back, and then I'll come back to this document when I am ready, which was 5 years later, because I got the document in 2010. I was living in Houston, Texas. And then I couldn't come back to it until 2015 in Gayle's class, basically, in Tahoe. So yeah, and part of the reason was the ancestors and the pain that it was bringing up, and that trauma, which, there was an ineffable element to it. It wasn't just the words, it wasn't just the story, but I was feeling it in my body. Like, I was feeling physical pain. And so they were always in this story. It was, they were always a part of it, not only just, in this way of, just kind of feeling it and feeling soul pain, and bodily pain, but they drove what happened in terms of, my father's life and my life, and, the actions that they took, the actions that they weren't allowed to take, the structures that were in place that kept them in a certain position that oppressed them. Okay, let me just say it straight. Like, they were oppressed in many, many ways. And so, for all these reasons, the ancestors were there, and it made this thing so big, to tackle. But they also made me recognize the importance of telling the story. And there was a comfort there to know, that it's about them. It's not even really about me. It's not about my dad. Like, it's, this is so much bigger than just the words on this page. Like, this is about them. And so I should not, when I'm in fear, when I'm afraid, then that's me being afraid for myself. But when I think about them and, the ancestors, I'm one, but I stand as 10,000, because my ancestors are there. When I make it about Walter and Lucille and my dad's 11 siblings and those who came before them, then I'm so much stronger, and it takes the fear away because it's not about me anymore.
Beautiful. Thank you, Leta. And I think that ties in beautifully with the question from Chloe, because when we write, we're not, family stories, we're not just writing about ourselves. And so we don't just have the ancestors with us, but living relatives who have to live with the, the consequences of having a story out in the world. So Chloe asks, how much, if at all, did you ask others to give permission when you were revising and publishing? And for myself, I gave a few people veto power. My husband, my grown children, because my younger child was too young at the time to know what I was doing or offer permission, and my sister. And the person that that writing about family stuff has been hardest for, it has been my sister. And we had to have a lot of painful conversations because she had felt like my writing about our mother's suicide felt like an act of violence against her, my sister, because she wasn't choosing to tell the story publicly the way I was. And it was really painful to have these conversations. She's so much more important to me than publishing a book. So even though I knew I would have to write because that's how I process things, if she didn't want me to publish it, I would have not published it. Ultimately, she gave me her blessing, which I'm really grateful for, but that was after a lot of therapy, a lot of continuing to talk about it. I'm curious what it's been like for you writing about family and how they feel about it, whether anyone in your life had veto power or just, how you navigated all that.
Yes, and similar to you, like the people are way more important to me than publishing something. I'm not out here to hurt anybody. I'm definitely not out here to exploit any kind of situation. And I also think that, for me, the issue of consent comes into play. It's really important for me when I'm telling a story to consider, number one, am I the person to tell this story and why? And also, like, what story is mine to tell and what story belongs to someone else? I mean, I do believe, some stories are mine, and I can tell them. I don't need permission to tell those. But there are other stories that aren't so clear cut. And so it's really important to me to get buy-in from people. Not that I'm willing to be censored, but I think that consent really matters, when you're talking about other people's lives. And so I did. I mean, like, I wouldn't have written this book if my dad were against it. He's still alive, but he wasn't, in fact, I think he was relieved when I first asked him in my awkward way, to know about his story and to tell him, at the same time, like, I think we need to write this down. Like, this needs to be a book because it's history. But it was important to me. And if he didn't want to share this, if he wasn't comfortable with it, it wouldn't be here. Similarly, where my mom came into play, or my brother, other folks, I did, just let them read the manuscript and just hear what they had to say. And no one tried to stop me from saying anything. Like, there was one anecdote that my dad told me. This is when we were, talking initially about, just early childhood stuff. And, later on through his young adulthood, he told me this anecdote. And he asked me, and it's not material really to the story. He asked me, he wasn't comfortable with me sharing it. And I was like, okay, but I actually think it's awesome. Like, you should let me put this in the book. I think it's great. He thought it made him look bad. I didn't think it made him look bad at all. But since he was uncomfortable with it, and, especially because it wasn't really essential to tell the story, I didn't put it in there. So that's how I roll.
Awesome. All right, we should probably leave some time for questions from the audience. And I see Amanda, this looks like it's a question for you, Leta, if you want to read it.
Yes. So the question from Amanda, hi friend, is, she says, the lesson I've taken the most, not just from your father's story, but from yours, is that each person can be and do extraordinary things. Absolutely. Unlikely, even unbelievable, an intensely inhale question. For parents doing extraordinary things, what gems can they take with them? For parents doing extraordinary things, what gems can they take with them? Well, I think, You know, I love what you said about how each person can be and do extraordinary things. And I think, this book is about, an ordinary guy in an ordinary place where something really extraordinary happens. And I think in every life, there is this mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. And so it's just a question of having the eyes to see this, like having the lens, to recognize this. There's so many uncanny events. I mean, that if you really just sit and think about, the trajectory of any given life, how much has to come together to make certain things happen. And so as far as, gems that people can take for parents doing extraordinary things, I just think that it's really simple. Like the extraordinary is actually really simple. I think it really just boils down to, these ideas of, it's this idea that, people want to be free. As simple as that sounds, people are in their own way trying to get free. And, that sounds really simple. It's really complicated how people go about that. Within systems of oppression and outside of those systems. And certainly there are prices to be paid for doing that, trying to get free. But I think that the gems that people can take, from these extraordinary events is just really to just focus on the simplicity, of the extraordinary, the extraordinary nature of an ordinary life. I don't know if that I'm really making sense, but I just think that life really is, it really comes down to, people wanting to get free all around the world, not just in Jim Crow, Mississippi, not just in Memphis, not just in America. And so, and that freedom does not exist in this, and I'm kind of paraphrasing Angela Davis, but freedom does not exist in a paradigm of individualism. So freedom takes community. And I think this book talks about that. And I think that's the gem that everybody can take. It's not, life is not about rugged individualism. Extraordinary lives are not stories of rugged individualism, but of community. Was there a point in there? I hope I made sense.
You made so much deep, beautiful sense. Yeah, thank you for that, Leta. Edgar asks, how do you tell a story about family, but changing the events, personal characteristics, and details so that individuals could not have grounds to sue? There are so many ways of approaching this. You could write it as fiction. So if you're changing a lot, then writing it as fiction is an option. Another way is just having a disclaimer at the beginning of the book, just saying that some things have been changed. Hopefully people won't sue you. There have to be certain grounds. I did a whole class on this and now I don't remember the details, but yeah, I think stating things as they are without judgment and just allowing the situation to speak for itself and being as implicating yourself as much as anyone else in the story. As writers of memoir, it's important to look at ourselves openly and honestly and critically too, instead of placing blame. So that's a way of doing it too. But I know many writers who have found that it feels safer to write their story as fiction because they don't want to open themselves up to potential lawsuits, but also just the pain that can come from telling a family story at times and the consequences. But it's such a tricky thing to navigate. There's a wonderful anthology called Family Trouble or Family Troubles. I never remember whether it's plural or not. That's edited by Joy Castro on the pleasures and perils of writing about family. And I think it's a book that helped me a lot. And it's a book that is really illuminating. Some people have an amazing experience writing family where it brings them closer together, and for others it creates a real rift. So you just have to decide what you're willing to risk and how. All right, we just have 3 minutes. Betty, I'm not sure if this is a question for both of us or just for Leta.
Both or either.
All right. Leta, would you like to answer Betty's question?
Sure. I'm going to put my website here because I have a contact form that goes directly to my email. So in other words, if you put, a message in there, that shows up in my inbox, and that is a great way to get in touch. And then we can kind of proceed from there. But yeah, definitely reach out. I welcome conversation with you all. So I'm trying to not misspell my name. It's LetaSeletzky.com. So I'm going to try to get that in the chat.
And then there was the question of how much of your writing is midrash, your interpretation of events because you don't have the details. And I think, so much of writing family stories, even if we have details, becomes our own interpretation, seeing the work through our own lens. And there's an exciting, newly named sort of genre of creative nonfiction called speculative nonfiction. And that can mean bringing in fantastical elements, but it can also mean what, I forget who named it, but perhapsing, where we just, riff on what might have happened when we weren't there, where we do fill in the details, where we use our imagination. I think that's always, there's always some of that when we write nonfiction, because we're bringing our own limited exposure to stuff to the page and having to fill in blanks and stuff of that nature, while trying to be as emotionally true as possible and sharing as many facts as we can. I don't know if you want to tackle that at all. I know we just have a minute left.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that when we're telling a story, it's always going to be our interpretation of events, even if we're writing like a dictionary entry or I guess that's not the best example. Encyclopedia is what I meant to say. But yes, there is what is objective? I think that the idea of objectivity, is something that arises in a way out of oppressive systems where some person or group of people decide, that I am the authority. And so I think whatever we write is our interpretation of events. So we just have to know that and make that clear on the page.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what helped my sister make peace with my writing this story, is that she realized that I was telling my experience, that I wasn't claiming to be sharing her experience, that I was writing about my own perception of what happened with her mother's suicide, that my own experience, and I wasn't, claiming to be in her shoes at all. And so she understood that I was telling what I needed to tell, and through my own lens. And thankfully that brought us to a place of peace and understanding, which I'm so deeply grateful for. And I'm so deeply grateful for this conversation, Leta. Thank you so much. And thank you, Chloe and Shasta and everyone here for joining us. It's just been a joy and so deeply meaningful.
Thank you, both of you, for coming. We really appreciate it. This was so wonderful. I put all the links again in the chat. I hope that you will all take a moment to look at them. Thank you for coming.